The wind is a razor, carving the world down to bone and ice. It screams a language older than men, a tongue of pure, killing cold. Cale, the Apache scout, feels it not on his skin, but in his marrow. For 6 days, he's been the unwavering prow of this sorry flotilla of canvas and wood, breaking the frozen tide of the blizzard. Behind him, 20 souls in 5 wagons trust him with their lives, a trust as brittle as the ice forming on their beards. They paid him in coin in the last town, but he knows the real currency is their fear. They fear the mountains, they fear the snow, and most of all, they fear him, the man they need to survive. He is a necessary devil, a savage to lead them through a savage land. He sees it in their eyes when they think he isn't looking, a flicker of contempt warring with their desperation. He doesn't care. Contempt won't keep them warm. Desperation will. It keeps them following his tracks, keeps them from the sweet, deadly sleep of the snow. He halts his horse, a tough little Mustang as weary as he is, and turns in the saddle. The world is a maelstrom of white, the wagons behind him little more than spectral shapes, their lanterns feeble yellow eyes against the onslaught. The lead wagon, belonging to the wagon master, Henderson, is close. But his eyes drift to the third wagon. Thorne's wagon. It's heavier than the rest. Its canvas double thick and tied down with a paranoid's precision. Jedediah Thorne, a man who carries his Bible like a shield and speaks of salvation, yet whose eyes hold the same flat cold as a frozen lake. Throughout this ordeal, Thorne has been the most demanding, the most suspicious, his questions about the route laced with an unnerving intensity. Cale has been paid to guide them all, to see this train to the nascent settlement of redemption. But a cold knot in his gut tells him one man's redemption might be another's damnation. He fought the storm for their survival, never knowing that the one soul he'd spent a decade searching for was just yards away, locked in the cold heart of the very convoy he was trying to save. That was a close call. Before we see how our hero navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. Then shift to past tense for the main body of the story. The wind howled its mournful song, a symphony of desolation played on the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Cale had lived with that sound for most of his 30 years. It was the sound of his childhood, of the canyons where his people, the Chiricahua, had been kings. It was the sound of his grief, the same wind that had swept through their camp 10 years prior on the night the soldiers came. He had been 20 then, swift and strong, but not strong enough. He remembered the chaos, the shouting, the fire. He remembered being separated from his family, fighting his way back only to find ashes and ghosts. His parents gone, and Nita, his sister, just a girl of 14 with eyes like polished obsidian and a laugh like river water, vanished. For a decade, that loss had been the central axis of his life. It had spun him out from his people's broken world into the world of the white man, a place he navigated with the same wary caution he used in rattlesnake country. He learned their tongue, their ways, their currency. He learned that his knowledge of the land, the very thing that made him Apache, was a commodity they would pay for, even as they despised him for possessing it. He became a scout, a guide, a ghost who moved between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. He'd followed whispers and rumors of a captured Apache girl from forts to reservations, from dusty Texas towns to the muddy streets of mining camps. But the trail was always cold, a decade of dust settling over his hope until it was little more than a dull, persistent ache. Now, that same wind threatened to be his shroud. He pulled his worn wool collar higher, the fabric stiff with ice. He was leading this train for Henderson, a portly, generally fair man who was out of his depth and knew it. The rest were a mix of families seeking land, prospectors chasing dreams, and a few solitary figures whose pasts were as obscured as the trail ahead. And then there was Jedediah Thorne. Thorne had joined the train in dusty Willow Creek, a late addition. He presented himself as a missionary of sorts, a man doing the Lord's work. He spoke often of sin and damnation, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to comfort the frightened families. He carried an ornate, leather-bound Bible everywhere. But when he looked at Cale, his eyes were not filled with Christian charity. They held a chilling certainty, the conviction of a man who believed Cale was a lesser being, a creature of the wild to be used and discarded. Thorne's wagon was an anomaly. It was a heavy freight wagon, not a prairie schooner. Its bed was covered by a thick, dark canvas that was laced down so tightly no wind could lift its edges. It had no windows, no openings save for the front, and a tightly secured flap at the back. Thorne claimed it carried delicate scientific instruments and books for a new school in redemption. He tended to his team of 4 draft horses with meticulous care, but was fiercely protective of the cargo itself, often warning children away with a sharp word. As Cale scouted ahead, looking for any break in the terrain, any sheltering overhang of rock that could offer them respite, he saw Thorne walking alongside his wagon, his head bent against the gale. Thorne placed a hand on the canvas, a strange proprietary gesture, as if calming a beast within. Cale had seen a man do that to a prize bull once. It was a look of ownership, not care. A flicker of unease, sharp and unwelcome, cut through Cale's exhaustion. Something about that wagon felt wrong. He'd heard a muffled thud from within it yesterday, dismissed it as freight shifting on the uneven ground. Now he wasn't so sure. The wind was a master of deceit, making the pines weep like women and the rocks groan like dying men. It was probably nothing. He had to focus. Survival first. Questions later. The lives of 19 people depended on it. He spurred his horse on, the animal's weary sigh lost in the blizzard's roar. For 2 more days, they fought a losing battle. The snow piled in relentless drifts, burying the trail and sapping the strength of man and beast. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that stalked them, searching for any chink in their armor. On the 8th day, Cale found what he had been praying for, a deep, narrow canyon, its high rock walls offering a natural fortress against the wind. It wasn't salvation, but it was a reprieve. "We camp here." Cale's voice, raw from shouting over the storm, was a croak. "Unhitch the animals. Get them into the lee of the wall. We'll be shielded from the worst of it." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the weary travelers. The business of making camp began, a slow, clumsy dance of half-frozen fingers and exhausted bodies. Henderson clapped a heavy hand on Cale's shoulder, his face a mask of frost and gratitude. "I don't know how you did it, Scout. I truly don't. We'd all be frozen statues back on that ridge, if not for you." Cale just grunted in response, his gaze already sweeping the makeshift camp, his mind cataloging tasks. Check the animals. Ration the remaining fodder. See who had frostbite. The work was never done. He moved through the camp, his moccasins silent on the snow. He checked on the Henderson family's oxen, saw to it that a new mother, Mrs. Gable, had enough firewood near her wagon to keep her infant warm. His duties were clear, but his eyes kept being drawn back to Thorne's wagon, parked slightly apart from the others, a dark, brooding shape against the pale rock. The wind was lessened in the canyon, its howl muted to a low moan, and in that relative quiet, Cale heard it again. A faint, rhythmic sound from Thorne's wagon. It wasn't the shifting of cargo. It was a soft, metallic scraping. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. The sound of chain against wood. Cale's blood ran cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. His instincts, honed by a lifetime of reading signs the world tried to hide, screamed at him. He watched as Thorne emerged from his wagon, carrying 2 buckets. He meticulously watered and fed his 4 horses, murmuring to them, stroking their necks. But he cast not a single glance toward the back of the wagon, where the sound had come from. He ignored it with a deliberateness that was more damning than any admission. Cale's mind, fogged with exhaustion, sharpened to a fine point. He had to know. He let the camp settle, let the weary families huddle around their meager fires, their figures casting long, dancing shadows on the canyon walls. He waited until Thorne had joined a small group, his back to his wagon, his deep voice carrying on about the trials of job and the necessity of faith in the face of tribulation. Cale circled around, using the deepening twilight and the jumble of parked wagons as cover. He moved with a predator's grace, a shadow among shadows. He approached Thorn's wagon from the rear, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest. He placed a hand on the frigid canvas. He could feel a faint vibration from within, a tremor of life. He leaned closer, his ear pressed against the thick fabric. The scraping had stopped. Now, there was only the sound of shallow, hitching breaths. He straightened up, his course of action solidifying. He walked back into the firelight, his expression as impassive as stone. He approached the group where Thorn was holding court. "Mr. Thorn," Cale said, his voice quiet but cutting through the man's sermon. Thorn turned, his benevolent expression tightening slightly. "Yes, Scout? What is it?" "Just wondering about your cargo," Cale said, his tone casual, conversational. "A heavy load for these mountains. Must be valuable." Thorn's eyes narrowed. The mask of the pious missionary slipped, revealing the hard, suspicious man beneath. "My cargo is my business, as guiding this train is yours. I suggest you tend to your duties and allow me to tend to mine." The words were a clear dismissal, a warning. Henderson, ever the peacemaker, stepped in. "The scouts just making conversation, Jedediah. We're all a little on edge." "Perhaps," Thorn said, his gaze locked on Cale, a silent battle of wills passing between them. "But some boundaries are best respected." Cale gave a slow nod, his eyes betraying nothing. "Of course. Boundaries." He turned and walked away, back toward the edge of the camp where his own small fire sputtered. But he wasn't retreating. He was planning. The denial, the cold thread in Thorn's eyes, had confirmed everything. There was someone in that wagon, a prisoner. And Cale, the man hired to guide these people to safety, now had a second, more urgent mission: to uncover the truth locked inside that dark, silent cage. The night deepened, bringing a cold so profound it felt as if the stars themselves were chips of ice. Cale sat by his fire, turning a piece of dried venison over the low flames. But he felt no hunger. His senses were entirely focused on the monolith of Thorn's wagon. Every shadow that moved near it, every gust of wind that rustled its canvas, sent a jolt through him. He was a hunter again, but his prey was not an animal. It was a secret. He spent the next day in a state of heightened observation. The blizzard had locked them in the canyon, a prison of circumstance. For the others, it was a curse. For Cale, it was an opportunity. He watched Thorn's every move. He saw the man's routine. In the morning, he tended his horses. Then, he would take a small, battered tin bowl, fill it with a watery gruel from his own pot, and disappear behind his wagon. He would be gone for less than a minute. When he returned, the bowl would be empty. He never spoke, his face a mask of grim duty, or perhaps disgust. He was feeding something, or someone. Cale knew he couldn't force a confrontation. He was one man, an outsider. Thorn had positioned himself as a moral authority within the group. An accusation from the Apache guide would be dismissed as madness or malice. He needed proof. He needed to see inside that wagon. His chance came on the second afternoon in the canyon. The sky had cleared to a brilliant, painful blue, but the snow remained deep, the route out still impassable. Cale, using his knowledge of the terrain, saw his opening. He scaled a portion of the rock face at the canyon's entrance, his moccasins finding purchase where boots would have slipped. From his vantage point, he could see the trail ahead. It was, as he'd expected, blocked by a significant drift. But he also saw something else, fresh tracks on a ridge above them. Mountain lion, large. He slid back down into the camp, letting a calculated urgency show on his face. He went straight to Henderson. "There's a cat on the ridge," he said, his voice low and serious. "A big one, likely hungry. It won't attack the whole camp, but it might try for a stray calf or one of the mules. We should build up the fires and post a guard." Panic, low-grade and simmering, rippled through the camp. The men, bored and restless from the confinement, readily agreed. Henderson, Thorn, and 3 other men grabbed their rifles, their faces a mixture of fear and grim excitement. A hunt was a welcome distraction. "Show us where you saw the tracks, Scout," Henderson commanded. Cale nodded. This way, but be quiet. Sound carries in this cold. He led them away from the camp, up the winding path toward the canyon's mouth. He took them the long way around, his mind a running clock. He pointed out the tracks, clear as day in the fresh snow. He described the animals' likely position, drawing their attention further and further away from the wagons. Once they were focused, peering into the dense pines on the far ridge, Cale feigned a need to check another angle. I'll circle around from the west, he murmured. See if I can spot it from the other side. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. They nodded, their attention consumed. This was his window. It would be brief. He slipped away, not to the west, but back toward the camp, moving through the rocks and shadows like a wisp of smoke. The camp was nearly deserted. The women and children were huddled inside their wagons, frightened by the talk of the predator. Mrs. Gable gave him a brief, worried glance from her wagon, but said nothing. He reached Thorne's wagon, his heart hammering against his ribs. The back flap was secured with a complex series of leather laces, tight as a drum. His knife slid from its sheath, the blade gleaming in the cold afternoon light. With deft, practiced movements, he began to work on the knots. They were stiff with frost, but his fingers were nimble. One lace came free, then another. He wasn't cutting them. That would be too obvious. He was unthreading the puzzle. Finally, a wide enough gap opened. He pulled the heavy canvas aside, peering into the gloom within. The interior of the wagon smelled of stale air, sweat, and despair. Most of the space was taken up by crates and barrels. But on the far side, bolted to the floor, was a cage. A heavy, iron-barred cage, no bigger than a dog kennel. And inside it, huddled in a pile of filthy straw, was a human form. A woman. Her back was to him. She was skeletal, wrapped in a thin, ragged blanket. Her black hair was matted and hung down her back in greasy tangles. She was rocking slightly, a tiny, repetitive motion of pure misery. As Cale's eyes adjusted to the dark, he saw the glint of metal. An iron collar was around her neck, attached to a short, heavy chain bolted to the cage floor. A wave of cold fury, so intense it was dizzying, washed over Cale. To see any human being treated this way was an abomination. He had to know who she was. He made a soft sound, a quiet clicking noise with his tongue he hadn't made in years. It was a signal he and Nita used to use as children when they were hiding from their parents. The figure in the cage stilled. Her rocking stopped. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp angles beneath sallow skin. Her eyes were dull, clouded with trauma. But they were her eyes. The shape of them, the deep, dark brown. They were Nita's eyes. Cale felt the air leave his lungs, as if he'd been kicked by a horse. The world tilted, the canyon walls seeming to spin around him. It couldn't be. After all this time, after all this searching, to find her here, like this, it was a cruelty beyond imagining. She didn't seem to recognize him. Her expression was blank, a wasteland of suffering. Cale's mind raced, trying to bridge the 10-year gap. The young girl with the laughing eyes was gone, replaced by this broken creature. He needed to be sure. He looked closer, his gaze falling on her hand, which clutched the blanket. On the knuckle of her right index finger was a small, crescent-shaped scar. A scar she'd gotten when she was 8, falling from a pine tree she'd dared him to climb. It was her. It was Nita. The truth slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He felt a roar of pure, primal rage build in his throat, but he choked it down, turning it to ice. He couldn't lose control. Not now. To attack Thorne would be to get himself killed and leave Nita to her fate. He was alone, surrounded. The men with the rifles, the men who trusted Thorne, would be back any minute. With trembling hands, he began to relace the canvas flap, his movements swift and sure despite the storm raging inside him. He had to put it back exactly as it was. His mind, once a scout's map of trails and shelters, was now a warrior's map of tactics and vengeance. The goal of his life had changed in an instant. It was no longer to guide a wagon train to redemption. It was to tear Jedediah Thorne's world apart and pull his sister from the wreckage. He finished the last, not just as he heard the crunch of boots in the snow. He melted back into the shadows behind a neighboring wagon. Thorn and the others returned to the camp, empty-handed and grumbling about the cold. Thorn went immediately to his wagon, running a hand over the laced flap at the back, his eyes sweeping the area. Cale watched him from the darkness, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. For a moment, Thorn's suspicious gaze seemed to settle on the very spot where Cale was hiding. Cale held his breath, his entire body coiled like a snake. Then Henderson called out to Thorn, asking about the watch schedule for the night, and the moment was broken. Thorn turned away. Cale slipped away, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had found his sister, and he had found her tormentor. The blizzard that had been their prison was now his shield. But it wouldn't last forever. The snows would melt, the trail would open, and he would have to find a way to free her before they reached the town, before Thorn and his monstrous secret were swallowed up by the so-called civilization he claimed to serve. The following day, a cruel mockery of hope dawned. A Chinook wind, warm and hungry, began to blow down from the mountains, devouring the snow with an astonishing speed. The temperature rose, and the oppressive silence of the snowbound canyon was replaced by the sound of 1,000 tiny waterfalls as the drifts melted away. For the settlers, it was a sign of deliverance. For Cale, it was the winding of a clock. Henderson announced they would be ready to move by morning. They were only 2 days' ride from redemption. Cale's time was running out. He spent the day in a fugue of controlled rage. He performed his duties with a mechanical precision, his face a granite mask that betrayed nothing of the inferno within. He checked wagon wheels, advised on repacking loads, and scouted the now visible trail out of the canyon. But all the while, his mind was a whirlwind of strategies, each more violent and desperate than the last. He could kill Thorn in his sleep. A silent knife, a quick retreat into the mountains with Nita. But she was weak, in no condition to travel hard. And the settlers, finding their spiritual leader murdered, would hunt him down with a righteous fury. He would be a savage killer, just as they always suspected. The story of Nita's captivity would die with him. No, violence was a blunt instrument. He needed something sharper. He needed to turn Thorn's own weapon, his perceived righteousness, against him. He had to expose him, not just kill him. And to do that, he needed an ally. His mind settled on the quiet widow, Mrs. Gable. She was a woman who had known loss. Her husband, the train's original wagon master, had died of a fever a month back. She had a quiet strength about her, and more importantly, she watched everything from the periphery. She had shown Cale a small kindness, offering him coffee, a gesture of humanity in a place where he was treated as little more than a tool. And he had seen the way she looked at Thorn, not with the reverence of the others, but with a flicker of something else. Fear, distrust. He waited until dusk, when the camp was busy with the evening meal. He found her tending to her small fire, her infant sleeping soundly in a basket nearby. "Mrs. Gable," he said softly, so as not to startle her. She looked up, her expression wary. "Scout, may I speak with you? It is a matter of great importance." She hesitated, glancing around the camp. Speaking privately with the Apache guide was a breach of the unwritten social code. But something in his voice, a raw urgency he could no longer completely conceal, made her nod. "What is it?" Cale didn't waste time. "It's about Mr. Thorn's cargo." Her eyes widened slightly. She put a finger to her lips, her gaze darting toward Thorn, who was leading a prayer circle near the main fire. "We shouldn't. I know there is a woman in his wagon," Cale said, his voice a low whisper. "I have seen her." Mrs. Gable went pale. The fear in her eyes was now stark and real. She looked away, staring into the flames. "You saw wrong. It's just freight. Look at me," Cale insisted, his intensity holding her gaze. "I saw the cage. I saw the chain." A tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her composure crumbled. He told my husband before he passed, that she was his ward. A poor, demented girl from a savage tribe. An orphan he rescued. He said he was taking her to his special church asylum in Redemption, a place that could heal her wild soul. He said it was his Christian duty. Her voice was thick with shame. "And you believed him?" Cale asked, his voice gentle but firm. She shook her head, another tear falling. "At first. But I've seen him. The way he looks at the wagon. The way he handles the food he gives her like it's poison. I heard her crying once, late at night. It wasn't the sound of a mad woman. It was the sound of a heart breaking. I wanted to say something, but I am a woman alone. My baby. Who would believe me against a man like Jedediah Thorne? This was it. The key. The crack in Thorne's armor. He is a liar, Cale said, the words coming out with a serrated edge. That woman is not his ward. She is not demented. She was stolen from her family 10 years ago. She is Apache. He paused, gathering himself before delivering the final, devastating blow. And she's my sister. Mrs. Gable gasped, her hand flying her mouth. Her eyes, wide with shock, searched his face, seeing not the stoic scout, but a grieving brother. The truth of his words settled over her, undeniable and horrifying. "Oh, dear God," she whispered. "I need your help," Cale said. "I'm going to free her, but I cannot do it alone. I don't need you to fight. I don't need you to pick up a gun. I just need you to do what you were afraid to do before. When the time comes, I need you to tell the truth, to bear witness." She stared at him, her mind grappling with the terrifying request. To stand against Thorne was to stand against the consensus of the entire wagon train. It was to invite scorn, ostracism, perhaps even danger. But then her gaze fell on her own sleeping child, so safe, so loved. And she thought of the woman in the cage. She looked back at Cale, at the profound pain and fierce resolve in his eyes. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of duty. She gave a single, sharp nod. "I will." A fraction of the immense weight on Cale's shoulders lifted. He was no longer entirely alone. He now had a witness, and he had a plan. He knew the land between here and redemption like the back of his hand. There was a place, a narrow pass, flanked by steep, unclimbable rock walls. A natural bottleneck. A place where a wagon train could be stopped. A place where a liar could be trapped with no room to run. The sun rose the next morning on a scene of renewed purpose. The Chinook had done its work. The path out of the canyon was clear. The settlers hitched their teams and loaded their belongings with an air of buoyant optimism. They were on the final leg of their journey. Redemption was within their grasp. Cale rode at the head of the column, his face as impassive as the granite cliffs around them. Inside, his entire being was a tightly wound spring. He led them through the foothills, the terrain growing rougher, the trail narrower. He felt Thorne's eyes on his back, the man's suspicion a palpable force. Thorne seemed more anxious now that their destination was near, eager to be back within the comforting walls of civilization where his secrets would be safe. By midday, they reached the entrance to the pass. Cale named its serpent spine in his own tongue, a tight, winding passage barely wide enough for a single wagon. High, sheer rock faces rose on either side, casting the trail in a cool shadow. This was the place. He brought his Mustang to a halt, raising a hand. The entire train groaned to a stop behind him. Henderson rode up, his face etched with impatience. "What is it, Scout? Why are we stopping?" "Wash out ahead," Cale said calmly, dismounting. "A bad one. The melt has weakened the trail. I need to inspect it on foot. It could collapse under the weight of a wagon." It was a plausible lie. Grumbling, Henderson agreed. The settlers began to climb down from their wagons, stretching their legs, glad for the unscheduled stop. Cale saw Thorne emerge, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. This delay, this assertion of Cale's authority, clearly infuriated him. This was the moment. Cale didn't walk toward the supposed washout. Instead, he turned and strode with deliberate, unhurried steps back down the line of wagons. He walked past Henderson, past the Gable wagon where the widow watched with wide, fearful eyes, past the prospectors. He walked until he stood directly in front of Jedediah Thorne. "We have a problem, Mr. Thorne," Cale said, his voice not loud, but carrying with an unnatural clarity in the enclosed space of the pass. Thorne drew himself up to his full height, his hand instinctively going to the large Bible tucked into his belt. The only problem here, Scout, is this unnecessary delay. Get this train moving. The train will move, Cale said, his eyes locking with Thorne's. But you'll be leaving something behind. The other settlers, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation, began to gather. They formed a loose circle, their faces a gallery of confusion and concern. Henderson pushed his way to the front. What in blazes is going on here, Cale? Cale ignored him. His entire focus was on Thorne. I am finished guiding you, he announced to the assembled crowd. But I will take what is mine. He raised a hand and pointed one steady finger at Thorne's wagon. I have come for my property. A shocked silence fell over the group, followed by a ripple of nervous murmurs. Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. He turned to the others, spreading his hands in a gesture of paternal reason. You see, the strain has been too much for him. The wilderness has reclaimed his mind. He is addled. He then turned back to Cale, his voice hardening. You have no property here, savage. Now stand aside. Cale didn't move. He stood his ground, a rock against which Thorne's authority was about to break. He took a breath, and then he called out a name, a word in the Apache tongue that hadn't passed his lips with any hope for a decade. Nita, it is Cale. I am here. His voice echoed off the rock walls. For a moment, there was only silence. Thorne's face was a mask of contemptuous victory. Then, from inside the dark wagon, came a sound, a frantic rattling of metal. It was the sound of the chain being pulled taut, of a body throwing itself against iron bars. And then a voice, hoarse and cracked from disuse, but unmistakably female, cried out a single word. Cale! The settlers gasped. Henderson's jaw dropped. This was not the incoherent rambling of a madwoman. It was a name, a cry of recognition and desperate hope. The entire narrative Thorne had carefully constructed disintegrated in that one, heart-wrenching sound. Thorne's face went from ruddy confidence to ashen panic in a heartbeat. The lie was exposed. His authority was gone. He was no longer a man of God. He was a jailer. His hand darted from his Bible and reappeared holding a heavy Colt revolver. He leveled it at Cale. She is my property, he shrieked, his voice shrill with desperation. A savage I bought legally from a patrol down on the Brazos. She belongs to me. The admission hung in the air, damning and ugly. He had just confessed to being a slaver. Before anyone could react to the gun, a new voice cut through the tension. That's a lie. All eyes turned. Mrs. Gable stepped forward from the crowd, her infant held tight to her chest. Her face was pale, her body trembled, but her voice was clear and strong. You told my husband and me that you were a caretaker, her guardian. You said you were taking her to an asylum out of Christian charity. She took another step, her eyes flashing with righteous anger. You are a liar and a brute. I heard you strike her. I heard her weep. Her words were a hammer blow to Thorne's last shred of credibility. The settlers looked from Thorne's panicked, sweating face to Cale's stoic resolve, to Mrs. Gable's unwavering testimony. The truth was plain to see. They had been duped by a monster hiding behind a holy book. Cale saw the shift in their eyes. He had won. He started walking toward the wagon, completely ignoring the pistol still aimed at his chest. Stay back, Thorne screeched, his hand trembling. Cale didn't even falter. He walked as if the gun did not exist. He reached the back of the wagon, pulled the hatchet from his belt, and with two powerful, precise swings, shattered the heavy iron lock on the cage door. The sound of the breaking metal was the sweetest he had ever heard. He wrenched the door open. Nita, a bundle of rags and bones, stumbled out into the shadowed light of the pass, her eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. She was frail, filthy, and trembling, but she was upright. She was free. Her gaze found his, and the 10 years of pain and solitude collapsed into a single, explosive moment of reunion. She collapsed into his arms, her thin body racked with sobs, her fingers clutching at his coat as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. Cale held her, his own eyes burning with unshed tears, his face buried in her matted hair. He held his sister. He was whole again. Behind them, Thorne, seeing his whole world unravel, made a desperate bid for freedom. He turned to run, but two of the prospectors, their faces hard with disgust, lunged forward and tackled him to the ground, knocking the pistol from his hand. The self-proclaimed man of God was left groveling in the dust, his reign of cruelty over. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of profound, quiet relief. The loud drama of the confrontation gave way to a sacred stillness. Cale held Nita, murmuring to her in their own language, words of comfort and safety she hadn't heard in a decade. He gently unwrapped his own warm cloak and draped it around her shaking shoulders. He uncorked his canteen and held it to her lips, watching her drink with a thirst that seemed to come from her very soul. The other settlers watched, their faces a mixture of deep shame and a reluctant, dawning respect. They had been so easily led, so quick to accept Thorne's pious lies and to see Cale as nothing more than a savage for hire. The truth of the situation was a harsh mirror to their own prejudices. Henderson approached, his hat in his hands, his face deeply troubled. "Cale, we had no idea. On behalf of this train, I'm truly sorry. We'll give you whatever you need. Supplies, food, a horse for her." Cale merely nodded, his attention never leaving his sister's face. The apology was necessary, but it was just words. The only thing that mattered was the small, fragile weight of his sister leaning against him. Nita, hearing Henderson's offer, stirred. She pulled the cloak tighter around herself and looked up, not at Cale, but directly at the wagon master. Her voice was weak, but it carried the clear, precise cadence of someone taught in the white man schools. "He took me from a mission school near Fort Sill," she said, her English perfect. "10 years ago. My name is Nita. I am Apache." In those few sentences, she reclaimed everything Thorne had tried to strip from her. Her name, her history, her voice. She was not a demented savage. She was a woman, a survivor, with an identity she refused to let die. Cale knew, then, they could not continue on to redemption. That town, with its laws and its assumptions, was no place for her to heal. It was another kind of cage. He looked up, past the humbled faces of the settlers, toward the high peaks that clawed at the sky. Up there, in the hidden valleys and silent forests, was true sanctuary. He gently helped Nita to her feet. She was weak, but she stood, her hand gripping his arm. He led her to his Mustang, the tough little horse watching them with intelligent eyes. He swung himself into the saddle, then reached down, his arms easily lifting her slight weight. He settled her in front of him, her back resting against his chest, his arms a protective circle around her. For the first time in 10 years, she was safe. Without a backward glance at the wagon train, at the bound figure of Jedediah Thorne, or at the life he was leaving behind, Cale nudged his horse forward. He turned the Mustang not toward the open plains and the town of redemption, but up a narrow game trail leading into the deep pines of the high country. He had entered these mountains as a guide for hire, a man adrift in a world that didn't want him, his heart a hollow place of old grief. He left them as a brother, a protector, his purpose restored, his family reborn not in a settlement of strangers, but in the heart of the wilderness that had always been their true home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. They found their justice and happiness. What part of their journey against prejudice touched you the most? Let us know below.